Number 1. My room. I was having a hard time in life about 13 years ago. I was in college, but I made a few really bad choices in roommates. So I ended up moving around a little bit, here and there, during that period of time. I tried not to go back in with my parents for the longest time, and I guess if I had, I could have spared myself a little bit of hardship, but I didn't want to burden on them at all, not even paying for college. So I tried to involve them in as little of my decisions as I possibly could, although I have no doubt that they probably would have helped. Before I finally did give in and moved back in with them, the last place that I moved seemed like a pretty decent place at first. It was a house rented by people who were all around college age, although only one of them was a student. Everyone had their own room, and most people generally kept to themselves. It seemed pretty ideal, and although I did slightly know my roommates, I didn't know them very well. Something really strange, that I still have a problem explaining though, happened during the summertime. This was on a weekend, when I had got home from the one summer class that I was taking at the time. I was living about 45 minutes away from the school at this point, in a suburb. The class I was in was in the middle of the building and didn't have windows. So by the time I got out of the class, and then out of the building, I was shocked to see the drastic change in weather that had taken place. When I had gone to class, it was sunny, and without a cloud in the sky. By the time I got out, it was a completely different story. The sky was full of fast-moving green and black clouds, and even though it was only mid-afternoon, it was so dark outside. The wind was blowing pretty hard, too, and who knew how much worse it was going to get. I got in my car and headed home, hoping I could somehow make it before the rain started pouring down. I didn't think it could get any worse as I was driving home, but the wind was blowing my small car all around the road. I watched as grocery carts rolled around in parking lots, hitting cars, and lightning filled up the sky. But fortunately, it seemed like it was just a lot of buildup at first, and I was able to get home before anything really bad happened. However, by the time I did get there, according to the radio, we were in a tornado watch. I have to mention this because I don't think what happened would have happened if it hadn't been for the storm. One of my roommates decided to have some people over to party a little bit during the storm. It didn't bother me at all because the entire time that I lived there, I basically spent all of my time alone in the bedroom. A bit of noise didn't bother me, and there was no way that it could compare to the noise created by this storm. I was in my desk chair on my computer watching the storm when I heard some noises and voices I didn't know out in the hallway. That's when I opened the door and noticed the people going into my roommate's room. My roommate just told me he had some people coming over to hang out and enjoy the storm. I didn't care, and I was going to go back into my room, but one of the guys stopped and decided to talk to me. I really didn't want to stop and chat, but he wanted to, and I was a little bit too polite to try to get away. I'm one of those people that can easily be trapped in a conversation. After a while, he was called away to the other room to join the party. I went ahead back into my room and locked the door. I must mention I didn't do this because of the guy talking to me. I just always kept my bedroom door locked. It wasn't even a real lock. You could easily unlock it from the outside by using a screwdriver or even a fingernail to turn a little switch on the outside of the knob. It didn't take long before I heard a knock at the door. It was weird because no one ever knocked on my door for any reason, and when I got up to check, it was the friend who had stayed back and talked to me. He had a couple drinks in his hand, and he offered to give me one. Although I had plenty of my own alcohol, I decided to take it. Hey, it was a free drink. He asked if I wanted to come into the other room and join their party, but I declined. I let him know I wasn't really good around a whole lot of people that I didn't know. We talked for a few minutes while I finished the drink, and then he was called back by the friends into the other room. Now, this is finally where things begin to get a little weird. I was sitting at my computer and I began to feel really wonky. Things got really weird after that. Now, I can tell you that I have a really high tolerance for alcohol. I tend sometimes to drink a bit more than I should, but I didn't have anything that night, other than the drink the friend of my roommate gave me. Things went black for a little while. Then I was awake, and looking around in my room, I found myself lying on the floor. I looked around and I didn't see anything though. Then things went black again. Then I was awake again, and the guy who gave me the drink was in my bedroom. He wasn't doing anything though. He was just sitting beside me and looking at me. I looked over to the door and saw that it was locked. My mind told me that he must have unlocked it to get in my room, and that sent out warning signals in my brain. And before I could do anything, everything went black again. I couldn't make sense of what was going on, but in the few moments of clarity that I had, I suspected that he must have put some sort of drug in my drink. It was the only thing that could explain what was going on. And even though I was totally out of it, I was scared out of my mind. When I woke up again, he was sitting in a different place but still watching me. I looked at him as I felt dizzy and confused. I tried to move or talk but found that I couldn't do either of those. It was like I was paralyzed. Fear took over my entire body, but there was nothing I could do. All I could do was black out again. I must have been out for a long time, but the next time I got up, I was finally able to move again. But this time the guy was not in my room anymore. I managed somehow to get up on my feet, but I stumbled and fell and hurt myself. It was hard to move and I lay there for a while. The following day I felt like crap, but I woke up when there was a knock on my door. It was my roommate. He told me that he caught his friend breaking into my room. He was going through my belongings, but my roommate, a huge guy we called Gooch, grabbed the guy and threw him out of the house. It was the scariest thing that had ever happened to me, not being able to move or even make sense of what was going on around me. I hope it never happens to anyone else. Oh, and to end this maybe on a funny note, I lived with Gooch for about 8 months. We talked a whole lot, but the day we all moved out, my sister came, and I introduced her to Gooch. And she came to me and said, "Why is he named after a taint?" And I tell you, the entire time that I lived there, I had no idea that's what that word meant. But he was a cool guy, and he saved me. Number 2, Grandfather. This story is something that my grandfather used to tell me. He really enjoyed this story, and enjoyed telling it to us whenever he could. I can tell it easily, directly from memory, simply because of how often he told it to us. At the time, my grandfather's grandfather lived in Georgia. It was South Georgia to be precise. Plus, this happened early in the 20th century. This is pretty important because the area didn't have telephone service at that time, which matters to the story. Although my grandfather had a phone, he couldn't call or receive calls from his grandfather. One night my grandfather had this dream about his own grandfather. In the dream, his grandfather died. After he was dead, a door was taken off his store jamb. It was made up as a bier for a home visitation. While looking at his grandfather laying down on the door, the dead man sits straight up in the middle of the night, looking at my grandfather. His grandfather starts talking to him about visiting him more often. My grandfather was of course worried about his grandfather, but since he didn't have a telephone, he couldn't call to make sure that he was all right. However, he couldn't get it out of his head that he had to go and check on the old fellow. So he gathered up his 2 children, put them in the car, then drove them to his grandfather's home for a visit. Fortunately, when he arrived at his grandfather's house, the old man was okay. He didn't really think truly that anything was wrong. Perhaps the dream was just something that was a byproduct of guilt for not visiting. So it was a good thing that they had it, because he had a really good visit with his family. The very morning after my grandfather got back home, he got a phone call from his grandfather's minister. It turned out that his grandfather actually passed away shortly after the visit. He thought it was very, very strange, but of course he had to go back then and attend his grandfather's funeral. When he went to the funeral, he was shocked to see his grandfather laid out on the door, exactly like it had been in his dream. But of course his grandfather didn't sit up and tell him to visit, because the visit already happened. I always loved it when my grandfather told me this story. Because of an unusual dream, he was able to see his grandfather one last time before he passed away. Number 3. Nick. Back in high school, I used to hang out with some pretty intellectual kids who were also pretty artistic and such. I guess I was pretty smart too, but I always considered myself a bit of a slacker in the education department. But I had a good time talking to these people, and we were all involved in the drama club at school too. So even though I was a new kid in the school, I had found a group of friends that I felt like I fit in with. I never went to parties as a teenager, and I probably wouldn't have wanted to go if I were invited. I wasn't the type who drank as a teenager, and I didn't like being in really huge groups of people either. But my friends never went to parties either, so that was another way that we got along. We did have a little get-togethers though at night, but they were only between our group of friends. We always referred to them as poetry readings though, even if we never ended up actually reading poetry. When I first got involved with these friends, I found that I had a minor crush on this boy named Nick in the group. I've always been shy about my crushes though, and for the longest time I didn't reveal the crush. But every time we were near each other, I would just get that crushy feeling inside that I'm sure you are all familiar with. Nick was also involved in the drama club, but he wasn't an actor. He did work on set design, and there were times when late at night, he and I would be the only two people left after everyone else went home. During that time, we would talk a whole lot for hours, and I often missed dinner because I would get home so late after having our conversations. But it didn't matter to me because I enjoyed his company that much. There was usually anywhere between 8 and 12 of us that were involved in the little poetry readings that we had. Often as the night got longer, a female friend and I would be the ones who talked pretty late into the night. I didn't have a curfew ever, so I could stay out all night if I wanted to. And I really enjoyed spending those late nights talking to her. Plus, I also lived really close to my friend Elaine's family's second home, and her parents always allowed us kids to have our little poetry readings there, so I could just walk there. This was a really weird night, however. It was in November, and we always got snow in November, but this was quite the snowstorm that had begun falling before I even left the house. It was one of those ones that, when you walked out in it, you couldn't really see far ahead of yourself. It made you feel isolated and sort of alone. But I didn't mind walking through it in order to get to hang out with my friends. I got there a little later this particular time than usual, and everyone was playing a game by the time I arrived. I couldn't remember what it is though. But I was mostly looking forward to spending the time later talking to my female friend. But strangely enough, not very long after I arrived, her mother called and summoned her home. So I was left feeling a bit disappointed because she was my best friend, and I enjoyed talking to her. So for a while after that, I began talking to Nick, and he had been pretty interested in the snowfall. I wasn't a big fan of that sort of thing, but he asked me if I wanted to go up to an upstairs room and watch it out the window. I of course jumped at the chance to spend some more time alone with him, so I agreed. We went upstairs and we left the lights out in the room. The room was unfurnished as most of the house was, and Nick and I spent a good amount of time in the room talking. Can't explain how everything felt. I had this strange intensity. I'm sure most of you know how it feels, being a teenager and being alone with someone you had a crush on. You expect something to eventually happen. Nick looked at me intensely in the eyes. He asked me if I wanted to see something, and the way he asked me got my heart beating fast. I just nodded at him. Nick took his shirt and lifted it up. My teenage libido was pretty worked up, thinking that something intimate was going to happen, but that was quelled pretty quickly. Nick had tons of wounds on his body. He had welts and cuts, and it had looked like he had been tortured by someone. I asked him what had happened. Nick had been tied up and abused by someone that he had met. It was supposed to be an intimate meetup, I guess, but it didn't turn out that way. Nothing sexual happened, he told me. It wasn't rape, he told me, but once he was tied up, he was hit with a whip, cut with a knife, and basically hurt all over. When the date finally untied him, he put Nick into his car and then callously dumped him off in front of his house. There were tears in his eyes while he told me the story, but I wasn't feeling the same. I was feeling very angry. I asked Nick who it was that did this to him, and at first he refused to tell me, but finally he told me he met the abuser on a dating website. Nick had lied about his age on it. He was 17 at the time. He told me the username of the guy. He broke down and I held him, but he tried to make me promise that I would not do anything. Later on, I went and created a profile on the dating site he had used. Before I could even look for the guy that abused Nick, he contacted me. He asked me if I was into kinky stuff like bondage. I didn't know what to do. I sat there and looked at his profile. I thought of the wounds that he had inflicted upon the guy that I had a crush on, and I wondered exactly what I was going to do. I really wanted to meet this guy and give him a taste of exactly what he did to Nick. I could feel the fire in my stomach telling me to meet this guy. Ultimately, I did not. I'm sorry if you think I'm a chicken, but I'm not. I didn't meet the guy because I would have killed him. That's exactly what I was feeling. I wanted to take my father's gun and kill him for what he did to my crush. I have never felt more sure of anything in my entire life. It is not a feeling I enjoyed, and I rejected it because I didn't want to ruin my life by killing this asshole. Nick refused to report him to the police, and I respected his wishes. If you have ever had the urge to kill someone, I hope you never do. It's a cold, empty feeling that will haunt your soul for your whole life.
Hey y'all, Killer Orange Cat here. If you like this video, please let me know by hitting the like button. If you're not already subscribed to Killer Orange Cat, please feel free to click the subscribe button and bell below, or click the icon of Ichigo the cat that will appear at the end of this closing. Leave me a comment, and share this video with someone you think might enjoy it. If you have an original story you'd like narrated on Killer Orange Cat, please email it to the address included in the description. But most importantly, don't forget to make sure to check in your closet and check under your bed, because you never know where a Killer Orange Cat might be hiding. Good night.